we are going to get into the text, but before we do that, I want to ground us in a little bit of just a very brief laughter meditation, because in addition to that, we're going to be exploring a different kind of laughter, not the kind that is cultivated through comedic brilliance or even through the cuteness of our animals, but that's actually laughter as a response to the unexpected, which is really what we'll see in the biblical story. So that's what I'm going to invite you to imagine. We're going to do a little guided meditation now. No experience with meditation needed, but to kind of locate yourself in a time when you essentially couldn't help but laugh, so that we enter this story about the biblical matriarch Sarah, really understanding where she's coming from perhaps as well. And as I do this, I am going to invite you to picture a specific experience. And I will say right now, you are not going to have to share this experience, so don't censor yourselves. This is really something that was personal to you at some point in your life. And I also, before we start, want to say that I'm bringing this topic particularly in this challenging time and a heavy time that we're living through at the moment, where there may be as much crying and frustration in your life as laughter, if not more. And we're also going to be exploring kind of that tension there in the relationship between being in a really challenging time and where laughter might come up unexpectedly then as well. So if your moment happens to be a moment where you couldn't help but laugh during this time of pandemic, that's really welcome too. That's something we'll learn from. Okay, so I'm going to invite you to close your eyes or just get into a comfortable position. We'll just be here for a minute or two. We want you to take a nice deep breath. Find your sit bones rooted to your seat beneath you. Feel your body in space. Re-arrive in your own sensations. Notice any tingling, or maybe there's some heat, maybe there's some just different sensations from your environment interacting with your body. And on your next breath in, I'm gonna invite you to recall a time when laughter bubbled out of you unexpectedly. This could be perhaps even a time when it was inappropriate. There could have been some embarrassment there, or just surprise, a time when you couldn't help but laugh. Let your body recall the sensations of the experience, maybe some warmth in your belly or tightness in the corners of your mouth, especially if you were trying to suppress laughter, if there was maybe a tightness in your chest, watering in your eyes, or even a little ache in your belly if you were laughing particularly hard. Try to recall anything else about the situation. Who was with you, or were you alone? What was the general context? What happened right before the laughter? What happened after? Really let yourself be back in that place where laughter just bubbled out of you. And it may be that it's hard to recall one particular time at this moment, but invite you to, if you have found a moment, just take a deep breath to re-arrive in the space that we're in now. If anyone feels comfortable sharing, not necessarily the specific context of the experience, but I'm gonna invite everyone to share in a particular way. We're gonna learn a little bit about what comes up, what came up in that experience of laughter. I'll actually invite, if there are volunteers who are open to sharing, What were some of the factors that led to the laughter? Anyone's welcome to unmute or use the hand raise button. Right. And I also did promise that you didn't have to volunteer information. So if you prefer not to share, that's okay. I'll say that one of the things that came up for me immediately is one of my first experiences of leading high holidays as a student rabbi, a very green student rabbi in Eastern Washington with a very small congregation. And essentially what happened, my parents were in the front row. I caught my dad's eye in the middle of doing a shamnu, and he just had a particular glint in his eye, and I could not help but just kind of, I really had to suppress a lot of laughter in that moment. It was highly inappropriate. It was a very serious pre-high holiday moment. And I think I share that because I think there is an intentionality sometimes between those moments that feel so serious and so somber and the laughter that comes up. Okay, so with that in mind and with your own experience that you've tapped into, I'm gonna share now the text. We're gonna go through a few different scenes from the chapter of Genesis where Abraham and Sarah both get the information, the remarkable information that at the ages of approximately 90 and 100, they are to have a son after many, many decades of not being able to have children. So Rabbi Levi, I'm going to hope that I can share. Oh yeah, I see share screen now. Okay. I'll try to get to that. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Great. Okay, so this, again, this is one of the most infamous anecdotes about laughter that we have within certainly within Torah and possibly within the larger Jewish tradition. And it's also a bit out of character for Sarah herself. What we know about the matriarch up until this point in Torah is that she is a very willing and resilient co-sojourner with Abraham through many trials. She's had a serious and relatively hard life, I would describe. She has been in the role of host for many, many travelers, including in the scene that we're about to read. And she has been without children. She's been barren for 90 years. And according to Torah, her husband, Abraham, is 100. So here they are. And in this particular scene, Abraham has already greeted 3 strangers who come to the tents with a special message. And here is the message they're going to share. Can somebody please volunteer to read the first piece of text in English? I'm going to try to see hands. Rabbi Levi, if you see someone whose hand's raised, go for it.
Not yet.
Rebecca, thank you.
They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he replied, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old?" It cuts off on my screen at that point.
All right, and then, okay, actually, so that's a great place to pause just for now. So, so just to set the scene again, Sarah is overhearing. She's not directly a part of this conversation, but she's listening at the entrance of the tent, and she laughs to herself. It's sort of like a kind of an internal laughter, or perhaps laughed at herself, saying, "Now that I am withered, Am I to have enjoyment with my son, with my husband so old? Then Adonai said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I in truth bear a child old as I am? Is anything too wondrous for Adonai? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son. Sarah lied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was frightened. But he replied, you did laugh. It's a really interesting text, right? There's a number of different dynamics at play here, and I'm curious, before I jump into any kind of observation, I'm going to stop sharing for now, but I am going to share in the chat box if anyone wants to follow along with the text. They can, I believe, open that Google document and read the text aloud. But what do we observe? What surprised you? What stood out to you about this scene? Norma. I think to unmute yourself, please.
I put it in the chat box. If you read that carefully, it looks as if the he referred to is referring to Adonai, not to the messengers.
So
to
to go back,
show it again, you'll see what I mean.
that they said to him, where is your wife Sarah? And he replied, there in the tent. Is that what you're referring to?
No, further on. I can get mine out. I can't see it on the screen now.
But he replied, you did laugh. Is that at the very end?
Who is the he that replied? What's the sentence before that?
The sentence before that, Sarah lied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was frightened. But he replied, you did laugh.
Mm-hmm. Who is the he?
So, yes.
The he is.
I think you're absolutely right there. That is Adonai.
That he is Adonai.
Yes, correct. So this is a really rare moment. We don't know much about the relationship between Adonai and Sarah before this moment. And even here, there's an indirectness to it, because Adonai is speaking to Abraham about Sarah. He never speaks directly to Sarah, but what he's saying, but the he is Adonai, absolutely. Adonai is...
He is speaking directly to Sarah there. He speaks to her. You did lie.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Nancy Bott has a question.
Okay, Nancy, go ahead. Nancy, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm confused as to why Sarah, or curious as to why Sarah felt that she had to lie. Why couldn't she just admit that she thought that this was pretty absurd? And so yeah. I don't understand why she was, I don't know, self-conscious. What was going on for her?
Good question. A really good question. And I pose that to the group. What do you like? What was it about the whole context of this? Even though, you know, we actually, in the scene directly before this, Abraham also hears this same remarkable news from Adonai that they will have a son at this advanced state, and almost the exact same reference, he falls on his face and he laughs. So just in the scene before, Abraham has an experience of laughing in response to news from God. And yet in this situation, there's some tension between God and Sarah, whereas there wasn't with Abraham. And this may be something, there may be a challenging gender dynamic here, but essentially this second part of the scene with Sarah does come as a little bit of a surprise. Why would she be embarrassed? Why would she lie? What might have been going through her mind that made her insist to God that she had not laughed? Any thoughts on that? Steve?
Well, I think it's verse 14. She's challenging God's power. she's saying God can't do something, and who obviously can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, so there is that really supports what Rashi and a lot of rabbinic commentators later will kind of make sense of in this scene, saying essentially that Sarah's laughter had a note of disbelief that was directed to Adonai. And for that reason, Adonai came back with this rebuke, why did you laugh? Or you did laugh. And there's a sense there that somehow in her laughter, she communicated disbelief or incredulity at God's awesomeness that Abraham had not communicated, although the verbs are almost exactly the same in both cases. So it's a little hard to understand how one was interpreted as dismissive of God, perhaps, and one was not. Thank you. That's a really good observation. And Simcha is sharing in the chat box, they had prayed for a child for many years and now they're old, and he makes it happen. Exactly. So another, this is so remarkable, and also I think comes with, not without some bittersweetness to it. After 90, reaching the age of 90, having had so many decades of trying to have children, some might also naturally assume that Sarah had some either bitterness or that she had just given up on this experience of being able to have children. And it even says explicitly that her body was no longer menstruating. So it would be natural to assume she could no longer have children. So it may be that this miracle, unexpected as it was, came as somewhat of a shock to her, and that that was part of the reaction and also part of Adonai's response. Anyone else, things you notice in the text?
Norma?
I think it's interesting that Sarah doesn't really respond to the fact that she's going to have a child. She responds to the fact that she's going to have sexual pleasure with her husband. And we haven't talked about that at all. She doesn't even respond to the fact that she's going to have a child. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that she laughs to herself saying, now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so
Right.
old? So yes, absolutely. She's surprised, at least initially, at the prospect of having sexual pleasure at this age in her life.
Well, no one promised her sexual pleasure. They only promised her a child.
It's a good point. That's a good point. Yes, if anyone wants to respond, but that's and that could be one place that the laughter bubbles up. There could be some amount of giddiness in that prospect. There could be surprise. There could be a little bit of embarrassment. Whatever kind of her inner narrative is about relations with her husband, that absolutely could be a real source of the laughter. Thank you, Norma. That's a really great observation. Nancy, did you have another comment? Or was that? Or I see Jerry.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the nature of the laughter. I mean, laughter, one can laugh for many different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One can laugh because something's funny. One can laugh because one's uncomfortable. One can laugh. I mean, it's got all different reasons why we laugh, and so I wonder why she laughed.
Right. Back to that question. Why did she laugh? And any of those.
Was she?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Was she uncomfortable with this whole topic now? I mean, had it reached the point where it was like, oh, this is ridiculous? I don't get the sense that this is funny, ha ha. that this is, like a joke.
Right. Nancy, thank you. I think that it's really, we can't read her mind exactly, but just knowing where she's been and where both of them have been, I don't imagine, yeah, this wasn't like a fun giggly laugh necessarily, that, the personal sadness of not being able to have children for decades probably weighed very heavily on her, and she may also have done a lot of work to put that desire behind her. What we don't know, but to hear this after waiting so long for this specific prayer to be answered, yeah, I imagine it wasn't funny, haha. That there could be either some disbelief, maybe even some bitterness in this laughter. That's another possibility that some of the commentators raised, that there was a little bit of bitterness in the laugh at hearing news that, and maybe some of you can relate to this, that you've been waiting and waiting and waiting to hear something, and you've finally gotten to the point where you've made peace with not getting what you want or what you need, and that's when it happens. And that can be a really complicated feeling.
Rabbi Laura, we have Ellen Solomon, Catherine Edwards, and Stephen Cohen.
Wonderful. Let's hear from them in that order. Thank you.
Well, briefly, this isn't what I was going to say, but I think you can also laugh when you're surprised. Someone, trips and throws a glass of water, and you may just laugh because you don't know how else to react. So it could have been that she was surprised. But getting back to Norma's initial comment about the kind of ambivalence about the he. So yeah, in verse 13 it says, then the Lord said to Abraham. So in verse 13, clearly the he is Adonai. But when it says in verse 14, I will return to you at the same season next year, that's the same thing that the messenger said earlier. I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. So that seems to me, that's the messenger again, because God isn't going to stay away for a whole year and then return. God is with them. So there's no reason that God would go away and say, I'll return next year and you'll have a son. So I think that we're back to the messenger.
Interesting. I really appreciate that read. Right, that it's more likely, and we don't actually know the relationship between God and the messengers, were the messengers angels, who were these strange men who came upon them, but the idea of God taking leave for a full year and then coming back is a little bit, that's also hard to wrap our heads around, given that God has been in intimate contact with Abraham, at least, throughout this entire narrative. Thank you. Really good point. Catherine.
So yes, so I agree with a lot of what has already been said, and I just want to pose something. I'm not sure it's correct, just as an interpretation, because I have heard this before, that laughter was a euphemism for orgasm, or for her uterus quivering, was like a laughter, just like in the book of Ruth, feet were a euphemism for something else, man's sexual organ. So I was wondering, actually, either you or Lavi, if either one of you have heard that, because I have heard that before, but I'm not certain that is true or not true.
Catherine, thank you for raising that. That's really interesting and new to me. I hadn't seen that in the commentary on this particular piece before. And Rabbi Levi, please chime in if you've heard otherwise. But I do think that it fits with other ways that sensations and bodily experiences are described in Torah in indirect ways, and that particularly in the exaltation of sexual relations, that there are so many different ways in which that's described that are not directly that. And I don't actually know the Hebrew term for orgasm, so it may be that was a common euphemism for that, which would really shade this whole scenario very differently. Rabbi Levi, do you have any other commentary on that?
Yeah, there is the usage of the verb litzachek, not as laughing, but as being playful. that does in Torah refer to the act of making love. So it wouldn't be a far stretch to think of it as referring to orgasm.
Thank you. And yeah, there is, I think, regardless of whether it's orgasm itself or just that kind of giddiness or arousal of thinking about sexual pleasure, I think that can certainly be read into this text, and part of her experience. And how cool that after 90 years of hearing about her life, this is what we hear she's experiencing, and also not without complication because of the interaction with God that comes afterwards. Steve, go ahead.
It seems to me that there's a certain amount of cynicism in her laugh. I mean, it seems like she's, what, now after all these years, I'm going to get pregnant? And to reinforce that, in chapter 17, verse 17 of Genesis, Abraham laughs also. He says, to a 100-year-old will a child be born? With 90-year-old Sarah give birth? So he also laughs. And although he's not questioned, I think the other interesting thing is, why didn't she want God to know, or whomever, or the messengers? Why did she keep it a secret? Why did she lie about laughing? What was the issue there? One can imagine that she didn't. One can imagine that she kept it secret because she knew she shouldn't be laughing at this joyous news.
Right. I thank you. No, and I think that again goes back to a very popular rabbinic understanding of Sarah's laughter being cynical, and that's why God responds the way God does. And at the same time, I think another interpretation of the cynicism is that she's afraid to share that with anyone, or she doesn't have anyone else to share the laughter with. So it becomes this very private affair that she feels exposed by as soon as God questions, "Did you laugh?" And it does say.
Does that mean she couldn't share it with Abraham?
Perhaps not. And there is also an interpretation that there was a sense of needing to create shalom bayit between Abraham and Sarah, in reiterating that they both laughed to hear this news. They were both overwhelmed with that surprise and perhaps joy. Ultimately, it will be joy, but that they, I think it's no accident that they both actually have the same bodily response of this eruption of laughter when they hear the same news of blessing.
Thank you.
Steve, I've seen your hand for a few minutes. Go ahead.
Levi's comment made me think there's a lot more going on here than just laughing, because Yitzhak's name has the same root, and also Ishmael later on, who gets in trouble from playing mitzvah hacking, it's also the same root. So I think there's a whole dimension here about laughter that isn't about what we traditionally think about laughter, that ties Sarah and Ishmael and Abraham together in another dimension of this story that's above the literal dimension.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And that is where we're headed. We are going to, the next text that we'll look at does really look at the naming of Yitzhak. So thank you for noticing that. And also we'll touch on the scene that comes later that you're referring to between Ishmael and Yitzhak, where they are said to be playing together. And that playing is interpreted in a number of different ways, including that there was something inappropriate about it that ultimately led to them being separated. So thank you. Any final observations on this text before I'm going to share a drash by Aviva Zornberg that I really appreciate on this particular experience of Sarah's. And then we'll get to the other text in question, which I hope generates some more thought. So while Rashi and a number of commentators contend that Sarah was derisive in some way, or in her laughter, there was that sense that a few of you have named, that she was cynical about this after so many years of like, are you serious, essentially. Aviva Zornberg understands, who's another wonderful rabbinic scholar, says that Sarah was not mocking the news or her body. She was simply reacting naturally to the unfathomable possibility becoming possible. It was in that moment that this pure, contagious laughter swells in her. So that it was not so much, it was this experience, yes, of absurdity, but that the absurdity wasn't about cynicism and despair, which in other scenes she does actually kind of quite physically enact in other ways. This is laughter of uncertainty, and that sense of not knowing the end of the story and imagining what could be. So it's actually a hopeful laughter that's born of not, having this seed of possibility planted and not knowing at that moment whether she really will have a son or not. So you could call that doubt. You could certainly call that doubt. But also just that enormity of uncertainty about something that she's hoped for so long actually coming true. And there's that kind of laughter of, could something that I called impossible be possible? And that is that laughter of uncertainty, and just the experience of uncertainty is certainly something that we are all grappling with in different ways as we experience different chapters of this pandemic. And I don't know about for you, but for me, many of those experiences of uncertainty are excruciating. It's very hard to sit day to day with not knowing when and how and what will evolve in our daily lives. And those moments where there's at least the glimmer of hope that something will happen that we've been hoping for, it can elicit that kind of giddy response of uncertainty or not knowing what the next chapter will hold. So you can take it or leave it. That's Aviva Zornberg's interpretation, and one that I think really just gives a different context to this laughter than either that it was derisive or what we've raised, which has been really interesting, that it was just kind of a natural bodily response to imagining sexual pleasure, or that it was something else entirely, just a spontaneous response to news that she really had not expected to hear. So that's the first scene of laughter, and I think whether or not there was cynicism in it, when she finally comes to the naming of her son, when she does have a healthy son 1 year later as promised, we're going to see sort of the way she reclaims that laughter. I'm going to share the text with you all one more time, and we're going to kind of see what we can draw from there, and also about what that legacy means for her son who gets his name. I'll share my screen once more. Oh, nope. All right, here we are. Everyone can see the text? Okay, so this is still in Breshit, but we are several verses later. And the Torah confirms, now Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children? Yet I have borne a son in his old age. And the Hebrew there that I really appreciate is, where is it? Abraham ben Sarah, Yitzhak bano v'tomar Sarah, tzachach asali Elohim kol hashomea Yitzhakli. So everyone will laugh with me, essentially, in response to God having brought me laughter. So with this later interpretation, now that she has a son in her arms, and she's proudly naming him Yitzhak, from the same root of laughter, does anyone have different responses or understandings of what might be going on for her internally? Or did that change your initial interpretation of why she laughed? Nancy, go ahead.
Okay, so since nobody else is jumping in at this point, well, I think her laughter is very different at this point. I think her laughter is from joy at this point, not surprise. God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. I just think that she's filled with joy at this point at having a child. This is a year later. She's got the child. She's gotten used to it. That's. I mean, she does. It does refer to who would have said Abraham that Sarah would suckle children. But there again, it's. I think it. Yeah, I really think that it's joy.
Beautiful. Thank you. So in this case, maybe it's a little bit more straightforward. And if there was ambiguity in the first scene about whether God was angry with Sarah for this laughter, or whether the rebuke was really about the fact that she laughed and that she should be ashamed of laughing for some reason, in this way, she really seems to be claiming a narrative for herself where she has no embarrassment. In fact, she sees the laughter as a gift. God has brought me laughter. There was that was actually part of the gift. In addition to the son, was the laughter. And I also think it's significant that while she was very alone, she was at that solitary kind of laughing to herself or at herself in the first piece, until God kind of calls her out essentially. In this way, she says, everyone who hears will laugh with me. So all of a sudden it's moved from being this very private experience where she's exposed for laughing and maybe there's some shame there, to a shared, joyous, collective laughter. And which I wonder if that has something also to do with, beautiful, thank you, Pam. Pam also named that in the chat box. She's not hiding it this time. This says she's not hiding her son. She's enormously proud to have given birth. And Judy's adding maybe wonder as well, that wonder or awe can also be another reason to just laugh, at the same way I think that people often laugh at weddings, as they're reciting their vows or seeing something particularly joyous and just can't believe that this actually is the step that they're taking forward. Norma. We can't hear you.
Why do you think that the author who wrote this story then goes in the next sentence to have her be as vitriolic and hurtful and hateful as one could be toward Abraham's other son?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's a question.
No, I know. It's a good question, and I think it goes to Steve's point also that was raised before, that we're seeing snapshots, of a life that was very complicated and also involved a lot of injury to others. And we'll see Sarah in a scene very soon to come, where her son, Yitzhak, is playing with Ishmael, Abraham's son, with Hagar, and she has a violent fit essentially, and banishes Ishmael, and there is enormous pain and rift that comes with that. Why does that happen right after this scene? Are they connected? Is it the same person? Is it consistent? I think that a lot of her multifaceted humanity is revealed here, and I don't think one scene redeems or discredits the other. I think that this isolated moment when she has just given birth and she is overwhelmed with joy and she feels noticed by God, in a way that perhaps she hasn't in her life before, is a joyous moment, is a wondrous moment, and that probably instantaneously with that holding her son as she's naming him, there's also a ferocity of needing to protect this child that she has created out of absolutely unexpected circumstances, and it doesn't justify the cruelty with which she treats Ishmael, and it doesn't clarify the ambiguity with which he and Hagar are banished. But I think what it does remind us of is that she is not only the worst scene in her life. just as none of us are the worst moments in our lives, nor are we always the best moments in our lives. So if this scene is her at one of the best moments of her life, when she is able to share generously this joyous laughter that she believes others should have with her, it doesn't mean that she can't have a vicious moment, or a enduring painful relationship with a family member moments later. I think that's really important to raise, that laughter isn't, it can be transformative, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's precludes bitterness that will come in other chapters. Stephen. Oh, we can't hear you as well. Go ahead and unmute.
I have the altar translation in front of me, and the line is, laughter has God made me. Whoever hears me will laugh at me. And apparently the Hebrew in verse 9 is medashak, and it has the connotation of mocking. And so maybe her anger is triggered by the fact that she fears she will be mocked, and she needs to assert her authority by becoming the sole woman in the partner, wife, and her son being the only son, not two sons. So
Interesting.
I don't know if that's
well,
true, but he has.
What's that?
Yeah, he altar clearly implies that it's a double-edged sword.
That there's a threat to laughter.
Yeah, she fears that she could be mocked
Mhm.
because of her age and the circumstances.
I think that that's one very, very interesting and valid interpretation, and I think that would be one way. As is true with so many scenes in Torah, where whether it's a le or a beh, the kind of grammatical nuance of that's associated with the different verbs can shade them very differently. So whether others will laugh to me or at me or with me or about me, all of those are on the table, and all of those do imply a different kind of inner emotional landscape there. If she's, but what I think is also possible based on, without necessarily disagreeing with Alter, I think what is also possible here and what other commentaries pick up on is that she's kind of moved through waves of disbelief and uncertainty and come to a place that she really, it has a new confidence to it and a new sense of faith in God, and that whether people can't believe it or not, they will see her faith through this lifting up of her son, who really did come to be born at this age of 90. And so those commentators say that Isaac's birth sparked waves of other babies being born to previously barren women, illnesses healed, goodness restored, so that others could share in the joy and laughter of that moment. So I think that what you're highlighting, Stephen, is kind of like that there's critical nuance in how you interpret that particular verb, whether she did fear being laughed at, or she really finally had something joyous to laugh with others about. Pam.
Hi. So two things. One is that we have God's intervention to open a womb for the first time, right? And I don't think in the subsequent times that it happens, but I'm not sure, but I don't think anyone laughs about it. So I just wonder if that makes this singular. And the other thing is also to kind of look at a theme being set up, which is that being singled out by God for some special, we'll call it an intervention, can set an individual up for mockery. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a biblical theme that is probably going to have other iterations. And so I'm just kind of seeing that here for the first time.
Right. Beautiful. I think that's That's really interesting. That, and is the mockery tinged by jealousy or simply disbelief or difference of circumstances? That is really complicated. And just as when we kind of name what makes us laugh, sometimes there is a purity of joy to it, and sometimes it is tinged with kind of there's also jealousy in the laughter, or mocking in the laughter, or derision, or doubt, or confusion, and that this is a unique circumstance. It's one of the very few times that women laugh in Torah at all. And it's certainly the only time that laughter is associated with the birth. And we know from so many other experiences of naming in Torah that names are very significant. So I do think we are meant to pay attention to the fact that Yitzhak gets the name Yitzhak from this legacy of laughter that's unique. And that's complicated, as we've all raised. It could be in mocking, it could be in joy, it could be in disbelief, or some combination thereof. And it's laughter from both of his parents, because we know from a previous scene that Abraham laughed as well. But I appreciate your raising that, Pam, that it could be that she will be further ostracized, that people just really can't believe that this happened to her.
Well, and I think the mockery inherent in the laughter from Ishmael is probably, just kind of made her lash out because she's already vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So the use of laughter here on a literary level is just mind-boggling. So I'm done.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It is. I think the same way other classic stories that we read are named comedies, but they have that incredible tension of relationship in them. Laughter is complicated. Thank you. Catherine, and then we'll wrap up. These are great comments.
So two parts of the story that are missing. So Sarah was impatient, didn't really believe that she would conceive, and she really orchestrated Hagar becoming the mother of a son that would be actually her son, Ishmael, because Hagar was a slave or a concubine. She was given in Egypt. So basically Sarah didn't trust that in her old age she would get pregnant, so she kind of hurried the process up. I think she did feel mocked by Hagar. And then after she had her own child, and later I guess saw them play together, that's when she banished Hagar and Ishmael. And so she was really a very whole person in many ways.
Yes. Absolutely. She was a whole person, right? And she was not a clairvoyant person either. She did not know when she condoned Abraham having a child with Hagar that she would in fact have her own child. And we could read backwards and imagine she would not have condoned that had she known she would have her own son. And that goes on to shade the way she treats Ishmael later on. And I think that final point is that the point about the whole person, I think, is really, really important here, that rather than putting Sarah on trial for both the best and the worst of what happens in her life, which we could do with any biblical figure or with our own selves, and sometimes we have that temptation to do that over the Hagim, to just notice the laughter and maybe also sit with our own uncertainty about what exactly that laughter was about, because more than it's an intellectual understanding, it's this really felt, remarkable response that's uniquely human. And I'm seeing Rabbi Levi in the chat share that Jews for a long time have responded to oppression in daily life with laughter. It's something we use to cope. So that brings me to my last two quotes, and that's what'll close us out. And I really, again, appreciate all of your close reading of the text. I think it has really enriched without clarifying at all what it is that made Sarah laugh. But I have two quotes, one by Professor Meir Soloveichik, which really also underscores Rabbi Levy's point. Jews love jokes because They express the idea that there is more to life than meets the eye, that a pattern is not eternally set in stone, that our expectations can be uprooted, that there is a completely different way of seeing a given situation. And so you can see that in the brilliance of comedic timing, when there's something that really we laugh about just because we really didn't see that coming, not necessarily because that isolated comment would be funny on its own, but because in context we didn't see it coming. And there's a wisdom in that, being able to capture the unexpected and turn it on its head. We have a whole holiday of Purim, which is said to be as holy as Yom Kippur, where we turn on its head that which we expect. Laughter bubbles up, and transformation also happens in that process. And I'll leave you finally with another possibility about this laughter of Sarah's that she shares with others. Whether or not they were laughing at her, if we understand her to be laughing now with others in this final moment of naming her child, laughter is a communal connective tissue. And one statistic I found was that you are 30 times more likely to laugh with others than by yourself. Think about that. It is an act of faith rather than doubt, an act of defiance and triumph rather than acquiescence. While Sarah might not have been able to control her reaction before, now her laughter is deliberate and forever bound up in the name of her child. Isaac's name is a symbol of Sarah's hope that she can still become the matriarch of a nation. And that's a fragile hope. As we named, it comes with challenge later on. It is perhaps a most intentional reaction to name her first and ultimately only offspring after a force that is uncontrollable. Laughter, in its role as a bodily response to the unexpected, allows us to forge ties, to build a sense of connection, and uncover the joy that makes way for the profound. That is no joke. That is from Rabbi Ariella Rosen. And so I'll leave you all with a blessing as we have thought about what's in a laugh, essentially, that it can also be this connective tissue, and whether it's laughter that's contrived or laughter that bubbles up by surprise, it is healthy for us to experience this laughter and to share it. So particularly as you're experiencing the Hagim, I'm not saying we loaded our high holidays with lots of jokes and moments for intentional laughter, but if you do find yourself either inspired to go rewatch something that you named that helps you laugh, or something unexpected comes up in one of those holy moments where laughter just bubbles forward, to really embrace that and maybe even invite God to be in that experience of laughter with you and see what might be learned from that. Thank you all for really rich, engaging study. Thank you, Rabbi Levi, for organizing today. And I wish you a very sweet rest of your Elul. May it continue to inspire good learning.